Sheriff Ethan Miles was a respected figure in the small town of Fairfield, Texas. At 43, Ethan carried the weight of 2 decades in law enforcement, earning the town's trust as a no-nonsense leader who kept crime in check. But beneath his polished uniform and reassuring smile, Ethan harbored a dark secret. He had been involved in an illicit affair with Tessa Langley, a 19-year-old high school dropout working late shifts at a truck stop diner. The affair had started innocently enough, casual flirtations and stolen glances over coffee. But soon, Ethan became intoxicated by Tessa's youthful energy, a dangerous thrill he couldn't resist. Tessa, lost and desperate for a way out of her dead-end life. For months, the sheriff juggled 2 worlds, playing the devoted husband to Dana, his wife of 18 years, while secretly meeting Tessa in secluded motels outside town. Ethan promised Tessa stability, telling her he'd eventually leave Dana and that they'd start a new life. But as time passed, Ethan grew cold, and Tessa became an afterthought, a fantasy he'd indulged in and was now ready to discard. Everything changed when Tessa discovered she was pregnant. The news hit Ethan like a sledgehammer. The last thing he wanted was a child that could unravel his carefully constructed life. "You can't keep it," Ethan said when Tessa told him. His words stung more than she expected. She pleaded with him, reminding him of everything he had promised, but his response was chilling. "I have a family to protect," he whispered, his voice devoid of the warmth that once captivated her. For the first time, Tessa saw Ethan for who he truly was. Not a hero, but a coward, hiding behind a badge. Alone, frightened, and with no one to turn to, Tessa felt trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. Meanwhile, Dana had sensed something was off for months. She'd enjoyed Ethan's long nights at the station and his sudden bursts of anger, but she never had concrete evidence. Now, rumors were circulating. A teenage girl from the truck stop diner seen with Ethan, his car spotted parked outside a cheap motel. Dana confronted Ethan late one night. "I know you're hiding something," she said through gritted teeth. Ethan brushed her off, warning her not to snoop where she didn't belong. Tessa, meanwhile, grew more desperate with each passing day. Ethan stopped returning her calls, and her dreams of a stable future faded. As her belly began to swell, so did her anger. She wasn't going to let Ethan walk away from her or their unborn child without consequences. On the night of August 3rd, 2018, the tangled web of lies and deceit finally began to unravel. Ethan was at home, enjoying dinner with Dana, when his phone buzzed with a message from Tessa. "I need to see you now, or I'll tell her everything." Ethan stared at the message, feeling the noose tighten around his neck. He had thought he could control the situation, control Tessa, but now it was clear that his perfect life was crumbling and he was running out of time. Ethan made a hasty excuse to Dana, telling her he had to handle an emergency at the station. As he slipped out the front door, he didn't know that this meeting with Tessa would be his last. The sheriff's car cut through the darkness, headed toward the outskirts of town. Tessa waited for him in an abandoned parking lot by the old train station. When Ethan pulled up, she approached his vehicle with slow, deliberate steps. She was no longer the hopeful girl he had met months ago. Her face was hardened, her eyes cold with determination. "Get in," Ethan said. Tessa climbed into the passenger seat, her hands trembling as she tried to control her emotions. "What do you want from me?" Ethan asked, his voice low and dangerous. Tessa locked eyes with him. "I want you to stop pretending you care." Ethan reached for her hand, but she pulled away. The tension between them was palpable, a powder keg ready to explode. Before Ethan could respond, Tessa leaned in closer, her lips curled into a bitter smile. "If you think I'm going to disappear quietly, you're dead wrong." The sheriff stared at her, realizing too late that he had made a grave mistake. Tessa's ultimatum hung in the air between her and Ethan, the tension thick as a storm rolling in over the Texas plains. Ethan's mind raced. If Tessa told Dana, his marriage, career, and reputation would be obliterated. He needed to shut this down, fast. But Tessa was done being manipulated. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I already wrote Dana a letter," she said. "If anything happens to me, she'll know everything." Ethan's jaw clenched. "What do you want, Tessa?" he asked, trying to maintain control. "I want you to do what you promised. Take care of me and the baby," she whispered. But even as she said the words, she knew Ethan's promises meant nothing. He'd been lying from the beginning, and she was finally ready to admit it to herself. Ethan shook his head slowly, frustration boiling beneath his calm facade. "There's no baby. You can take care of it, or I will," he said coldly, his eyes narrowing. Tessa felt a jolt of fear and rage rise within her. "You're a monster," she whispered. "You're no different from the criminals you lock up." That was when Ethan snapped. He lunged toward her, grabbing her arm. "You listen to me," he hissed. "You'll do exactly what I say, or you won't like what happens next." Tessa yanked her arm free and pushed the door open, stumbling out of the car into the darkness. Ethan scrambled after her. Panic seized Tessa, and she sprinted toward the overgrown lot behind the train station. Ethan chased her, cursing under his breath as he tried to catch up. She tripped over a piece of broken pavement, and before she could get back up, Ethan was on her, his hands clamping around her wrist. "You think you can ruin me?" he growled. A struggle ensued, a chaotic blur of grasping hands, gasps, and raw desperation. Tessa clawed at Ethan's face, trying to break free, but he was stronger, and the years of stress and fear had made him ruthless. In a sudden, desperate move, Ethan shoved her to the ground. Her head hit the edge of a concrete slab with a sickening thud. For a moment, everything was still. Ethan hovered over her, his breath ragged, his heart pounding in his ears. "Tessa," he whispered, shaking her limp body. But there was no response. The night closed in around him as he realized what he had done. Panic set in. Ethan glanced around the abandoned lot, knowing no one would believe it was an accident. He reached for his phone to call someone, anyone, but stopped. There was no way out of this. If Tessa's body was found, everything would unravel. His mind raced as he considered his options. He could report it as a suicide, but her injuries told a different story. He could run, but that would only make him look guilty. Finally, Ethan knew what had to be done. He needed to make her disappear. Under the dim glow of his car's headlights, Ethan carried Tessa's lifeless body to the trunk. His hands shook as he opened it and laid her inside, her limbs folded unnaturally. He closed the trunk with a thud and wiped the sweat from his brow. He drove in silence, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Miles of empty road stretched ahead of him, each passing minute a reminder of the terrible act he had committed. At the edge of the county line, Ethan turned onto a dirt road that led to an abandoned quarry. It was a place known only to a few locals, a place where secrets could be buried deep. He hauled Tessa's body out of the trunk, his breath coming in sharp gasps as he stumbled toward the water's edge. With a final heave, Ethan pushed Tessa's body into the dark waters. She sank slowly, swallowed by the murky depths. Ethan stood there for a moment, staring into the ripples as they spread across the surface. He thought it was over. Ethan drove home in silence, his heart pounding with every mile. He believed the nightmare was over, that the water would keep his secret buried. But secrets have a way of surfacing. The next morning, Ethan returned to his routine, desperate to act as if nothing had happened. Dana noticed his odd behavior, but said nothing. She had grown accustomed to Ethan's distance. For a moment, Ethan thought he might pull it off. But by noon, the phone rang, shattering that illusion. It was Deputy Mark Hastings, Ethan's longtime colleague. "Ethan, we got a situation," Mark said, his voice grave. "Someone found a body at the old quarry this morning." Ethan's stomach lurched. His mind reeled. "Do we know who it is?" he managed to ask, forcing his voice to stay calm. Mark hesitated. "Yeah, it's the Langley girl, Tessa." A cold sweat broke over Ethan's skin. "You want me on the scene?" he asked, hoping to maintain the facade of the responsible sheriff. "No," Mark replied. "Chief wants you to sit this one out. Figured it might be better considering." He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. Ethan clenched the phone tighter. The walls were closing in. "Right. Let me know if anything comes up." He hung up and stared at the receiver, his pulse hammering in his ears. The truth was out, and it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. Later that day, Ethan sat in his office, staring at the framed certificates and photos that once symbolized his success. Every accolade, every promotion felt hollow now. The knock on his door jolted him back to reality. Mark stepped inside, his expression grim. "We found something," he said, dropping a plastic evidence bag on the desk. Inside was a crumpled note, the letter Tessa had written to Dana, explaining everything. Ethan's world collapsed in that moment. The letter was in Tessa's pocket, Mark said, his eyes searching Ethan's face. "We're going to have to bring you in, Ethan." There was no point denying it. Ethan knew the game was over. The irony of being arrested by his own deputy wasn't lost on him. He nodded slowly, his hands trembling as he placed them behind his back. Mark gave a sad shake of his head as he cuffed Ethan. "Never thought it'd end like this, Sheriff." In the following days, the story of Sheriff Ethan Miles' affair, the pregnancy, and the murder spread through the town like wildfire. Ethan's arrest was the final betrayal to the people of Fairfield, who who had trusted him to protect and serve. The trial began 6 months later, and the courtroom was packed with reporters and residents alike. Ethan's defense lawyer tried to argue that Tessa's death had been accidental, the result of a heated argument gone wrong. But the prosecution painted a damning picture. A man who abused his authority, manipulated a young girl, and killed her to protect his reputation. Dana testified during the trial, her composure a mixture of heartbreak and resolve. "I knew something was wrong," she said quietly. "I just never thought it would go this far." The most chilling testimony came from Mark Hastings, who described finding the note in Tessa's pocket. The courtroom was silent as the letter was read aloud. Tessa's words a haunting reminder of a life cut short. "If you're reading this, Dana, I'm sorry. I never meant to hurt anyone, but Ethan lied to us both. I thought he loved me. I thought I had a future. Please take care of my baby, because I know Ethan never will." The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. Ethan was sentenced to 35 years in prison without the possibility of parole. In prison, Ethan found himself stripped of everything: his title, his freedom, and the respect he once commanded. The weight of his choices hung over him like a curse, and there were no badges or medals to hide behind. Dana filed for divorce soon after the trial ended, determined to rebuild her life without the shadow of Ethan's betrayal. For a time, the townspeople whispered about her, but over the years, their sympathy grew. She found solace in her children and eventually returned to teaching, a quiet strength carrying her forward. As for Mark Hastings, the scandal left a scar on the Fairfield Police Department. Though Mark never publicly condemned Ethan, the betrayal stung deeply. He stayed on the force, determined to restore the community's faith in law enforcement, but the shadow of Ethan's crime followed him for years. The old quarry where Tessa's body had been found became a somber symbol, a place the locals whispered about but rarely visited. A small wooden cross, placed by Tessa's grieving family, stood at the water's edge, a reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded there. And in the end, the people of Fairfield moved on, as small towns do. The sheriff who once protected them had become the very thing they feared, and the scandal faded into memory. But the lessons lingered about power, betrayal, and the dangerous consequences of lies. This is the story of Sheriff Ethan Miles, a man who lost everything when his secrets came to light, a cautionary tale that reminds us that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always rises to the surface.